if you are dealing with any of these issues, or if you have a predisposition to any of these issues, or if you're just trying to avoid any of these issues, the benefit of a keto diet is that it's one of the tools you can use to reduce your risk of most of those things. I think the more we learn about nutrition, the more we realize that there is no one size fits all approach. Everything has to be tailored to the individual. I think that we should look at it more of a metabolic state than we should an actual diet. I'll say that the best keto diet, the best any diet, is a whole food diet, limiting as much packaged and processed foods as you can. That's the best version of keto.
Welcome to Healthcare Liberty Labs with Tiffany Ryder, where we teach you what they don't want you to know about healthcare.
Welcome back to the channel. The uncomfortable truth is that a majority of Americans are metabolically unfit. And what I mean by that is we're not living our lives in a way that allows us to have the mental clarity or the physical energy that we really want in the short term. And we're not actually lowering our risk of developing chronic diseases, things like cancer and heart disease and dementia, in the long term. And when we go to our doctors or the medical establishment and we say, well, what should we do? The guidance isn't always clear. And a lot of times it really consists of, let's do this test, let's take this medicine, let's just wait and see, instead of taking a proactive approach and having clear guidelines on things that you can try and things that you can do to manage your symptoms. So I'm Tiffany Ryder, host of the Healthcare Liberty Lab, and today I am bringing you a conversation that might really change the way that you think about your metabolism and mental performance. Andy Schoonover, the CEO of CrowdHealth, and Chris Irvin, a ketologist, he is a keto legend, really discuss the idea of going on a journey through ketosis. What is ketosis able to address? What symptoms are people reporting that it helps with? What does the research say about keto? Is it healthy? Is it dangerous? It's one of those conversations that even if you've never considered low carb eating yourself, or you've heard that just keto is just another fad diet, it's an evidence-based discussion. And it's an alternative to only thinking about medicine through the lens of high cost, high impact interventions and drugs. And it offers what I believe is a great foundation if doing things on the lifestyle side of things before you get sick and before your symptoms become unmanageable is something that you're really interested in. And having a conversation, having access to the data in a conversation like this is a great starting point if it's something that you want to talk with your doctor or your nutritionist. I often say that one of the more dangerous things that we say in medicine is, well, that's how it's always been done. And we don't have to accept that. So if we've always waited until people get super sick to deal with something, cool. But we don't have to do that. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think this conversation offers some insight into that. So I hope you enjoy. Give it a watch and let me know what you think in the comments.
I think I've lost 30 pounds or something like that on keto. And, as we were walking around that party, I met somebody had, polycystic ovary syndrome, who said that she basically cured herself of it as a result of being on keto. And I know you have story after story. And so, it kind of I kind of joked before we started, the drug that our body produces, yet very few of us get the benefits of. And so I'm excited to talk more about ketosis, the biochemistry of that. And I'd love for you just to start, like, what are ketones and how do they impact us?
Yeah, for sure. So, sorry. There we go. I have to really set the stage before I talk about such an important topic here. So ketones they're energy molecules, I think is one of the ways that you can look at them, but they're also signaling molecules, which we can talk about that in a little bit. But I think, for the sake of introducing the topic, focusing on the energy component of them, I think is a good place to start. So, our body traditionally uses glucose for fuel. Well, I shouldn't say traditionally. More recently, in the last, probably 50 to 100 years, the human body has become more accustomed to using primarily glucose as its source of energy. So we consume carbohydrates, which the standard American diet is very rich in. Our body breaks down those carbohydrates into glucose or sugar. So this is where you hear the phrase blood sugar come from. And, that blood sugar then causes a spike in insulin, and insulin, its action is to drive glucose into our cells to be used for energy. So that's the primary energy source that most people are running on if you're eating a carbohydrate rich diet. Now, ketones are another energy source that our body actually makes. So it doesn't come from our diet, although we do have exogenous ketones, which we can get into those if we want to later. But they're an energy source that our body produces. And our body's done it for as long as we can, go back, human history. And it's kind of was a big part of our evolution as a species, was the ability for us to produce ketones. And the reason why is because ketones they can be a source of fuel during times when you're not able to consume food for energy. So the way that ketones are produced is that when our blood sugar is low, which makes our insulin low, we have another hormone that gets secreted called glucagon. And glucagon, it will interact with our fat cells to release our stored fat from our body, from our adipose tissue, or our fat cells. And then that fat can be used for energy throughout our body, but also it can travel to the liver, where the liver will break it down through a process called ketogenesis and produce ketones. And our liver is not able to, it's one of the few organs that actually can't use ketones for fuel. So rather than using the ketones for energy, it will send it out into our bloodstream, where they can then travel around the body to be used for energy. So, kind of talking about the evolutionary side of it, for a lot of human history, when we didn't have food in abundance, when we weren't able to, go get a snack at the gas station, on the way home from work because we were hungry, a lot of times we would go, a long periods of time without eating. It would be like this kind of feast famine approach that we would take, sometimes by choice and sometimes by necessity. And, during this time, fat and ketones would have been the primary fuel source that the human body would be using. And with ketones being the energy source that's produced by the body rather than, requiring us to actually consume it. So, and one of the things I think that's interesting about ketones that's worth mentioning, as we kind of break down the metabolism side of it, is that while almost every cell in our human body can use ketones for energy, most of our cells will forego using ketones to allow our brain to use them. And more interestingly, is that the brain will actually choose ketones over glucose as an energy source when given both. There's a preference for it to actually use ketones. So, if you probably a more accurate description of ketones would be is that they're an energy source for the brain specifically, which again, thinking about like our ancestors, going long periods of time of not being able to eat and then having to still, be in survival mode and be very cognitively engaged with your surroundings. Having, adequate energy to your brain would be really important. So, so that's kind of the backstory on the energy side of ketones.
It's so interesting. And so what you're saying is for thousands, millions, whatever years, like hundreds of thousands of years, probably, our species has survived by using ketones during the periods of time in which we aren't eating, right? Because there's longer periods of time in which we don't eat, and therefore the body, when we do eat, stores fat. Ketosis happens, takes that fat, turns it into energy, and then we use that storage to then survive, right?
Yep.
And so over a period of time, as we've introduced more carbohydrates into our diets, which really hadn't been there in a big way in the past, now we have insulin, which snags those sugars and tries to pull them out of our bloodstream. And ultimately, if you have too much of those carbohydrates, stores them as fat, which then feels like that's how we get fat, right? I mean, is that ultimately that's a super simplified, you have a master's of science. You get this stuff way better than I do. I'm just a doofus finance guy. But that ultimately, it seems to me like the point of insulin in today's world is totally different than the point of insulin thousands of years ago. Is that accurate?
Definitely. And, because insulin is a really interesting hormone that it often catches a bad rap because, it is the marker that you would be looking for metabolic health issues, right? Type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, things like that, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease. But insulin it's more than just a hormone related to blood sugar. Insulin actually plays a massive role in signaling of a lot of different processes in the body. So like our brain, for instance, a lot of, just keeping inflammation in check and preventing the buildup of plaque and stuff like that, things related to neurodegenerative diseases. A lot of that is controlled by having proper insulin signaling. Now, the issue is that, so insulin itself is not a bad thing. Where insulin becomes a problem, and, I will say too, you mentioned the storing carbohydrates for fat. So, one of the things that insulin will do, like you said, is it'll drive glucose into our bloodstreams to be used, or into our cells to be used for energy. And then, if we have, too much or more than we need to meet our energy demands, it can store some of it as glycogen. The carbohydrates can be stored as glycogen, but that's a very small reserve. And then the rest can be stored as fat. So that is one way in which we get fat. But another thing related to insulin is that insulin blunts fat burning itself. So if you have high insulin levels, you inherently will burn less fat. When insulin is elevated, the body, does not burn fat as much. So for people who are constantly operating in a state of high insulin, which would be, if you're constantly consuming carbohydrates, you're eating them with each meal, you're eating them in between meals, then you're going to be spiking that insulin more frequently and preventing fat burning and, contributing to, like, calories still matter and everything like that, but you're going to be contributing to the fat storage. Now, where insulin gets really interesting as it relates to fat storage and as it relates to the signaling of, things related in your brain, cardiovascular health, all of those things, is that when we are spiking insulin frequently and our cells are being constantly exposed to insulin, we develop what's called insulin resistance. And what that means is that when this hormone comes and it binds to the different cells in our body to initiate these various cascades of events, it's not able to do that anymore. The receptors on the cells actually become resistant to insulin's action. So then what happens is the body has to produce more insulin to complete these actions, which then further drives this problem of insulin resistance. So, you have a crossover where you'll go through a period of time if this is left unchecked, where blood glucose is high, insulin is high, and nothing is working appropriately. And then eventually that can lead to complete exhaustion of the system, where now you no longer produce enough insulin. And that's when you have to start taking exogenous insulin, which you typically see with people that have, more progressed forms of type 2 diabetes. So, insulin it's not, a lot of people think insulin is that you just don't want to have any insulin. What you want is insulin to be doing what it's supposed to be doing. And for it to be doing what it's supposed to be doing, it needs to not be spiked all of the time. And it needs to be operating efficiently and completing its action the way that it should.
Yeah. And so the audience might be asking, okay, you jump to insulin pretty quick, but yeah, they are interrelated, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yes,
to me, in my, again, simplistic brain, is if I'm having lots of carbs, my body is saying, use carbs as your energy source. Insulin helps us do that. But you do that too much over too long of a period of time, you become insulin resistant, which ultimately could lead to diabetes, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
So that's the simplistic way of thinking about that. Now, if you don't have carbohydrates or a low amount of carbohydrates, the body will say, hey, I don't have enough carbohydrates to fuel the body, so I need a secondary source. That secondary source is fat, right? Is that correct so far?
Yep.
And then you will produce ketones as a result of that. Am I getting this straight?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
And what's interesting about it too is that as it relates to keto, the keto diet, you always hear it being a high fat diet, and that you have to eat a lot of fat, and a lot of people will think that the fat is that you eat is directly related to the ketone part of this, of producing ketones, which is a fair jump to make, because the ketones are made from the breakdown of fat, but it's actually specifically ketones come from the breakdown of stored body fat. So when we consume dietary fat, that does get used for energy, but it has a very short kind of half-life in our blood. So that, I forget the exact time, but when we consume, dietary fat, it's packaged into these molecules called chylomicrons, and those can travel throughout the bloodstream to, deliver fatty acids to various places to be used for energy. But very quickly, that is either used for energy or it's put into storage. And you would think storage is a bad thing, but not necessarily a bad thing. It will store it in sites like around your muscles so that your muscles can very easily pull from stored fat to use, for energy. So, that the fat that you eat, having heavy cream in your coffee isn't going to increase your ketone levels. For ketone production to occur, it has to come from the breakdown of stored body fat, which is going to happen in a state of low blood sugar and low insulin, like you mentioned, which is going to kind of activate that process of burning the stored fat.
Gotcha. That makes a ton of sense. And therefore, let's jump real quick to what is a keto diet. So keto diet comes from the word ketone, right? Or
yep.
So what is the kind of the definition of a keto diet? And I feel like it's kind of gotten bastardized a little bit over the years. And so I'd love from the Ketologist himself, what is a keto diet?
Yeah, so I've been in this space for a little while now, and this has changed a lot. I would love to kind of go back to podcasts that I did in like 2016 or 2017 and see what I would have said back then, because a lot of times we try to break keto down into being one thing. We try to put it in a box. People will say that keto is a high fat, low carb, moderate protein diet is what a lot of people will say. You'll even hear specific macronutrient recommendations. So, and for those who don't know, macronutrients are your protein, fat, and carbs and fiber. So, a lot of people will say you need to have 75% of your calories coming from fat. You need to have 20% of your calories coming from protein. You need to have 5% of your calories coming from carbs. Now, that used to be what I would say for people, like that is what a keto diet is. Now, my thinking on this has evolved a little bit through the understanding that keto is still, it needs to be personalized for each individual. And, what each individual needs is going to be a little bit different based on their goals, based on their current state of their metabolic health. And, if they're trying to fight a disease, or if, maybe they're just trying to lose weight, all of those things would dictate how you would follow keto. So I don't really look at keto as being a high fat, low carb diet. I look at it as a metabolic state of ketosis, which is having elevated ketones in your blood. So just like we mentioned, this process of producing ketones, the term for having elevated blood ketone levels is ketosis. And that is where the term kind of keto comes from. Okay. So I like to say that keto is a nutritional strategy that induces a state of ketosis. And how you do that, there's many different ways you can do that. For some individuals, they may need to eat, if you are very insulin resistant, we just talked about insulin resistance, you may need to eat very little carbohydrates, like, even a little bit might prevent you from getting into ketosis because your metabolic health is a little bit more compromised. Whereas somebody who is very fit, working out a lot, has a really good, state of their metabolic health, they could maybe eat quadruple the amount of carbohydrates and get into ketosis, right? So like for them, it's a little bit different. And then there's also the question of, what degree of ketosis do you need to be in? So for somebody who's just trying to lose weight, then, you don't need to be at a very deep level of ketosis or have a lot of ketones in your bloodstream, versus somebody that's maybe using it for epilepsy, which is one of the first use cases of the diet, or even cancer treatment. We're starting to see that there's an ideal range of ketones in the blood that you would want to get to, and how you would get there would alter the diet. So for those people, you might be going like almost zero carbohydrates, and, higher fat, focusing on specific types of fat that would, be better for inducing higher ketone levels. So, it's kind of a punt on that answer of like what a keto diet is, but I think the reason why it's become kind of written off and looked down on over the last few years is because we've tried to put it in this box of it being one way. And I think the more we learn about nutrition, the more we realize that there is no one size fits all approach. That's everything has to be tailored to the individual. So, I think that we should look at it more of a metabolic state than we should an actual diet.
This episode brought to you by CrowdHealth. CrowdHealth helps you find awesome doctors, negotiate your bills, and fund those bills through our peer-to-peer funding platform for less. Welcome to an easier way to pay for healthcare.
Yeah. So, then the question is why? Why do we do this? Like, what is the point of being on keto? My kryptonite is chips and salsa. It will kick me out of keto very, very quickly. And so why give up, chips and salsa to be in ketosis? Can you, other than you just kind of said before, there's a weight loss component of this. If your body doesn't have carbs, it's going to go after stored fat. If it goes after stored fat, you will more than likely, lose weight if you are in ketosis. Or lose body fat if you're in ketosis. Oftentimes you may not lose weight if you're building muscle because you're eating more protein and things like that. So there's a weight loss component of this. But what else? What are the other benefits if I'm in ketosis will I see to my health, both as like a normal, somewhat healthy individual, and then you also kind of touched on a couple other things where there's epilepsy and PCOS and things like that could impact it. So what are the benefits? Why would I do this?
Yeah. So I'm going to separate kind of keto diet benefits and then ketosis benefits a little bit. So I think it's worth talking about both. So, part of the benefit of eating a keto diet is that, if you look at our population as a whole, we're looking at about 89%, I think is one of the numbers that gets thrown around a lot, of the population is not metabolically healthy. Something
I've
like
seen 88. So yeah, I've seen
88%. Yeah. So, really high percentage is not metabolically healthy. Most of it, I think it's, something like 1 in 3 people are pre-diabetic. 75% of them don't know it. We're trending towards a lot of type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, and just poor metabolic health in general. And a lot of that, if we talk about metabolic health and diabetes, that is insulin resistance, which, you talked about earlier, how insulin resistance can lead to diabetes. Insulin resistance is diabetes. That is what the cause of it is. So, combating that is going to be beneficial for most of our population. I mean, if you look at the fact that 9 out of 10 people are not metabolically healthy, that means 9 out of 10 people need to do something with their diet to improve their metabolic health. And what keto does is, there's two ways to look at a diet. There's what a diet is, and there's what a diet is not. So this is more on the stage of what a diet is not, in that it's not full of sugar. It's not full of processed carbohydrates. You're not eating a lot of processed foods, although, the food industry and kitchen chemistry has changed that a little bit lately with keto. But generally speaking, you're eating more whole foods. And when you're doing that, you're removing a lot of the foods that drive insulin resistance, that drive poor metabolic health. And poor metabolic health is at the root of most of the chronic conditions that we're seeing today. So it's not just prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Metabolic health is at the core of PCOS, like you mentioned, other reproductive issues, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. There's a component involved in cancer, cardiovascular disease. All of these things are rooted in metabolic health. So if you are dealing with any of these issues, or if you have a predisposition to any of these issues, or if you're just trying to avoid any of these issues, the benefit of a keto diet is that it's one of the tools you can use to reduce your risk of most of those things. So that's kind of one side of it. And then the other side is what
just
the
real
diet
quick on that,
is,
Chris.
because
I want to make sure that people get that, because, I think it's important to understand the why of this, right? And you just outlined a whole list of illnesses that we're getting, and not only does our metabolic health contribute, oftentimes it is the primary cause of all of these health conditions. So think about metabolic health is what we ingest, how our body processes that. Clearly that has an impact on a whole range of illnesses, conditions. Many people, we had Dr. Ovadia on our podcast. He's actually our number one. He thinks that is the primary reason of cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer of Americans for the last, he said, 70 years, which is crazy to me. So, this is a huge driver, everybody has to take a look at. And if you think about metabolic disease, I think there's 5 kind of components of this that you need to look at, which is your A1C, which is what we were just talking about. It's your blood sugars over a long period of time. It's kind of the an indicator of how high your blood sugars have been. Your waistline, which is just a component of weight, right? Obesity, if you're obese. Your blood pressure levels, which is another thing that can be impacted by your metabolic, or what you're ingesting, triglycerides, and HDL. All of these things are impacted by the food that you put into your body, and all of these things are going to kind of round out how you're doing metabolically, which will be the primary cause of all of these conditions. Not with your 30s and 40s like us, but maybe 70s, 80s, and 90s, which what we're trying to figure out at CrowdHealth, which is like, hey, it's great to be healthy in your 30s or 40s, but if we are metabolically unhealthy, we may not see some of that stuff pop up until we're 70 or 80, right?
Right.
And that's why this is so important to me. It's important to us at CrowdHealth. And so I apologize for stopping you there, but it's just one of those things where we have to focus on that, because people can think, 88% of are metabolically unhealthy. That probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but the fact that if you're metabolically unhealthy, you are much, much higher risk of having a chronic condition, in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that's why I wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And to riff on that a little bit too, I think it's important for people to kind of because metabolic health, the phrase is being thrown around a lot now. And, and there's a lot of different recommendations for how you can improve your metabolic health. But I think like at its core, if you look at like those blood markers that you talked about, like those are great ways for you to kind of see where you're at, and you can influence those through lifestyle and primarily through diet. And when you improve those things, you inherently reduce your risk of most of the chronic health issues that you can come across. I mean, if you look at cardiovascular disease that you brought up, everybody thinks that, cardiovascular disease is caused by cholesterol, high LDL, triglycerides, all of these things. But it's not. Those are just proxies of what's going on in the body. The reason why you have, elevated LDL, or the reason why you have, because LDL only matters as much as a lot of other things. It matters like the particle size. So there's VLDL. Like being insulin resistant and having poor metabolic health will increase the likelihood of you having VLDL, which is the more atherosclerotic LDL, the one that's more likely to cause plaque buildup. That's not from the fact that you ate fat. That's from having poor metabolic health and from being insulin resistant. If you're eating foods that are causing a state of inflammation, like keeping on that same kind of thought pattern, just having high LDL isn't a bad thing. LDL actually has a function in the body, but having high LDL in the presence of inflammation is a recipe for LDL to actually become a problem. So we shouldn't necessarily be looking at, well, why is LDL, or, LDL is high, we should lower it. We need to look at, well, why is LDL becoming a problem? Well, it's because we have, high inflammation. A marker you could look at for that would be like your hsCRP, or C-reactive protein. So that, and, across the board on cardiovascular disease, if you look at hypertension, you look at cholesterol levels, you look at triglycerides, triglyceride to HDL ratio, all of those things are all impacted by insulin resistance and poor metabolic health. So I think it's an important thing to understand, because a lot of times people will hear, okay, metabolic health is important for cardiovascular disease. I want to reduce my risk. You go on the internet, and then the internet will say, hey, you should stop eating fat. And it's important to understand that that's not how it works. There's a lot more kind of pieces to the puzzle. So really, if you're focusing on things like, keeping blood sugar stable, keeping insulin in check, which doesn't necessarily mean not, ever spiking it at all, but at least keeping it to the point where it can operate the way that it should be. That is what's going to make sure that all of the foods that you eat are being put to good use, that you're properly filtering out any of the bad stuff from your food, and your body's just doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then inherently reducing that risk of chronic disease later. So it is a complex topic, but it's the most important thing to understand, because whatever diet, if you look at diets across the board, so we're talking about keto now, there's a lot of other diets out there that can reduce your risk of different chronic diseases. But all of the ones that are successful, what they have in common is that they are combating insulin resistance to some degree. Even if you're just looking at a calorie restriction diet, just one in which you're eating very low calorie, the benefit of eating very low calorie is that you're reducing blood sugar and insulin spikes, and you're reducing insulin resistance. So really across the board, that is what's going on. So, and that's kind of where this comes in about, some of the benefit of what a diet is actually what the diet is not. And it's that those diets, keto included, don't contain the foods that are going to spike that blood sugar and insulin very frequently.
Man, that's so good. It's like, it's so complex. And we've talked a lot about the complexities already, but in reality, it is, we need to reduce our insulin resistance, right? We need to control insulin levels. And if we do that, it has a whole range of benefits for our body, which we just talked about. The other thing I thought was interesting was all the benefits of having reducing insulin resistant or not being insulin resistant. You see this all over the place. So we mentioned epilepsy. We mentioned cardiovascular. I've seen a couple things, and maybe it was even on your Instagram, where a lot of the mental health issues that we're seeing could potentially be because of insulin resistance. And so have you looked at any of those studies? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, a great resource to point people to is Dr. Christopher Palmer, he wrote the book Brain Energy. And he's a Harvard doctor, incredible credentials. And he kind of breaks down this whole concept. And what he's talking about is more related to a lot of the mental health things. So from severe things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, all the way to even just like general anxiety and depression, that there's this energy component, there's this energy deficit or impaired metabolism, which when we talk about metabolism, what we're really talking about, if we dig into the science a lot, is we're talking about mitochondria. Metabolism is something that's easier for people to understand, but mitochondria are the pieces in our cells that are responsible for a lot of the metabolic processes. They're the ones that actually kind of burn the energy or burn the nutrients for energy and produce a lot of the things that our bodies need. So, what we see with mental health disorders and, not just mental health disorders, but also a lot of the neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, we see that there is an impaired mitochondrial function or a damaged metabolism. And, metabolism isn't just producing energy, right? I mean, that is part of it. So for a lot of these folks that are dealing with mental health disorders or neurodegenerative disorders, there's an energy crisis in their brain. Their brain is not getting enough energy. Our brain, takes up, even though it only takes up like 2% of our body's weight, it eats up something like 22 or 23% of our total energy supply. So it has a massive kind of energy demand. And for a lot of these people, because there's insulin resistance, there's damaged mitochondria in the brain, their brain is not producing enough energy to meet the requirements, which leads to some of these cognitive impairments that you could experience. But even outside of that, these metabolic processes are also responsible for things like neurotransmitters, which are, the signals that get sent in our brain that can impact our mood, our cognitive function, our behaviors, all of those things. Those are all produced during metabolism. Metabolism is going to be responsible for the nutrients that are available and being absorbed, which are all, nutrients that our brain needs to function optimally. It's also, metabolism is going to be responsible for the production of inflammatory molecules, as well as the activation of anti-inflammatory pathways. So when all of these things are not operating effectively, you can get a whole host of disorders. So, the brain energy concept, it's not as simple as saying, insulin resistance is the cause of depression or it's the cause of bipolar disorder. What we do know is that metabolism and impaired mitochondrial function is at the core of that, and that is causing a slew of other issues that can lead to these other mental health disorders. And for Dr. Palmer to put that out and again, he's a Harvard guy, so really impressive credentials, and he's had a lot of he's pretty pro keto, and that's not something that's widely accepted in those spaces, and he has not really had anybody that's been able to argue with him. There's been a lot of doctors and researchers who maybe don't share the same nutritional beliefs as him, but they look at his work and they look at the research that he's citing, and they say it's pretty hard to argue that. So and the reason why that's important for mental health disorders is because and neurodegenerative disorders, and really most of the chronic disorders across the board, is that our treatment options for these things are not root cause focused. So for mental health disorders, you get put on prescription medication, and that prescription medication is altering the chemistry of your brain, and it's not addressing the root cause of the issue at all. And in fact, it's actually making it worse, because we now know that a lot of these psychosis medications can actually decrease metabolic health. They actually further contribute to the damaging of the root cause of these issues. So now it's not even that they're not targeting the root cause, they're actually making it worse. So that's, kind of strike number one against them. But then two, a lot of times these drugs, their effectiveness is reduced over time. And then this reduction in effectiveness leads to increased dosage, and then also switching of drugs. So, and that's not to say that, nutrition is going to come in and get people off of their medications. But what we have seen is that can reduce the dose. It can, for some people, it actually can help them get off of it. But for many people, it can at least reduce the dose. It can improve the effectiveness, a lot of things like that. So that's why I think this conversation is so important, because, these solutions for people are, most people in our current healthcare system, they enter the healthcare system and they'll end up worse off than they would have if they didn't, in some cases, right? Because they're not getting the type of treatment that is actually fixing whatever it is that's broken. It's symptom focused.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely the case with a lot of these mental health disorders.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Anecdotally, I try to be in ketosis most of the week. I've told this probably several times on this podcast, so I'm probably bore people, but my kids love pizza on Friday nights,
Yeah.
And so that boots me out of ketosis pretty quick. Pizza will do that to you. But I will tell you, like, and actually over the weekend, I had a birthday party in which I behaved poorly when it became to nutrition. And I actually came back the next day. It was out of town. I came back the next day. I just felt kind of grumpy. And even my wife was like, "You're kind of grumpy today. What's going on with you?" All that to say is there is a different feeling, different chemistry in my brain going on when I'm in ketosis versus when I'm not in ketosis. And so, and again, that's an N of one here, but I'm just saying, like, there to me seems to be, and I kind of started this with, like, this has been a game changer for me, both in terms of weight, the ability to add muscle mass, also just my mental state. I feel like I function better when I'm in ketosis. And you've explained the reasons why. There's a neurochemistry that's going on there, and those transmitters that function just better when you don't have all this insulin that's screwing up your processes. So I know that's just again an N of one, but it's, man, if you're going through something with mental health, if you're going, I always say, like, I'm not a doctor, so please don't take this as medical advice, but any friends, family that was like, I'm having headaches, I'm having joint pain, I'm having any of these things, I'm like, you should at least try a low carb diet to get into ketosis, just to see if that helps. Because a lot of times, and again, my N is not very big, maybe it's 10 in this case, the majority of the time, this has resolved the issue. Once you can get insulin under control, it goes a long way in fixing some of these things. And why wouldn't you try that before you jump on a pharmaceutical, which has all kinds of other, chaotic things going on in your body? And so I just think there's a lot to be said for at least giving this a shot. Somebody recently, and I don't know who it was, American Heart Association or something, said that the keto diet rated all the diets, and keto was the absolute worst for you, according to, was it the American Heart Association, or what it was one of those biggest associations?
I don't
you remember
which one. This is an annual thing. This is almost every year we get kicked to the curb like this.
So and the knock against keto is it tends to be high fat, high protein, and therefore you typically are going to be eating a lot of animal fats, a lot of animal proteins. And so this particular survey or ranking said that it was really bad because you're having really high cholesterol, and that's bad for your health. And so that's the knock on keto. So what is your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny the way that, you know, those things come out and people will take those things as truth, right? And they won't even go as far as you did to understand why, that they ranked them low. Because it is important to know the why, because if you know the why it's ranked low, then you can kind of start to pick apart and figure out how they kind of came to that conclusion. But it is all wrapped up in this idea that animal fat is bad for us and cholesterol is bad. And, nobody really talks about protein as much. I think there's some of the fear of protein is kind of going away a little bit. People are realizing, it's important, and most of our society does underconsume protein, but a lot of the worry about keto is wrapped up in the fat. So we can definitely talk about that. And I think it's important to mention too, what's interesting is that cholesterol itself, so dietary cholesterol, our body makes cholesterol. So LDL, and this is, I think, important for people to understand, when you're getting your cholesterol levels measured, you're not getting a measurement of how much fat you've consumed. The fat that's being measured in your bloodstream is not coming from your diet. That is we shouldn't even call them the same things because they're completely different. So LDL and HDL that you're getting measured, those carry cholesterol amongst other things, but it's a kind of a different thing. But dietary cholesterol itself, the dietary recommendations over the last 5, I know in the last cycle and in maybe the cycle before, they actually removed a lot of the negative kind of connotation associated with cholesterol, and they took away some of the recommendations against eating it, but they still refuse to say that it's okay to eat it. It's like, we don't think it's going to kill you, but like, we also are not going to recommend that you eat it. But I get it because, I think it takes time for, dogma to kind of work its way out. But, this fear of animal protein, it all dates back to the 50s, 60s when, we had this guy, Ancel Keys. There's actually a great book I have up here on it. The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz is a great investigation of this kind of history. But, Ancel Keys was a researcher that conducted a lot of research to promote saturated fat as being the cause of cardiovascular disease. And he put a lot of data out. And during that time, this was an idea that was, heavily supported by the government. This was heavily supported by a lot of the nutritional organizations. And it kind of became one of those, like, you either get on board or like you don't have funding for your research anymore. So a lot of the people that were posing a kind of counter narrative to this were silenced during that time. And so that became kind of the dominating theory. And it was his research that actually drove like the heart health hypothesis and the heart healthy diets and all of that, these low in cholesterol, low in saturated fat. And there's 2 things to point out about that. The first one is that a lot of that research was cherry picked. We now know, going back, that, anytime there was a piece of data from around the world that didn't, agree with his hypothesis, it just got thrown out. So the actual data itself that we saw wasn't very true to what was found. It was definitely cherry picked. But the other piece of it is that there's a misinterpretation of the research. So a lot of the fear of cholesterol, saturated fat, is because there's research that shows a correlation between the consumption of those foods and cardiovascular disease is typically the health thing that people are looking at there. And it's really important to understand, you hear this phrase thrown around a lot: correlation does not equal causation. And the reason why we have to understand that is that, these studies, what they are, they're large groups of dietary recall studies. So we get a massive group of people, and sometimes they're retrospective, where it's people who have already been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease in some form or fashion, or they can be prospective, where we review people's diets and then we see what what percentage of them get cardiovascular disease in the future. And so these people are self-reporting their diet, and they're saying, I'm eating, this, and this, which, for one, there's can be some inaccuracies there in what people are reporting.
I don't remember what I had for dinner last night, much less,
Right. Yeah. Go ahead and tell me what you ate 5 years ago and for the last 5 years. So that's one issue. But even a bigger issue is that, if somebody reports that they're eating a hamburger, for instance, that's being logged as eating red meat, eating saturated fat, having cholesterol. And so, what you may find is that somebody who eats a lot of hamburgers has an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Well, what comes with a hamburger? We have a grain bun that spikes insulin and blood sugar, high fructose corn syrup ketchup, usually served with a side of French fries cooked in seed oils, which we know cause insulin resistance and inflammation. But those things aren't taken into consideration, right? It's like they had hot dogs, so they had red meat. They had burgers, so they had, and actually, when you go back and you look at a lot of those studies, if you remove for variables like drinking and smoking, you actually see that because apparently people who drink and smoke also tend to eat a lot of red meat. So there was a kind of a correlation there where if you account for smoking and alcohol, then the increased risk of cardiovascular disease from red meat almost disappears. But even so, even if it was still there, the issue is that it's not really a full picture of what's going on. And that's not, I think a lot of people leave that story there and they say, well, correlation doesn't equal causation, and it's other things that could be causing it. But I do think it's worth going one level deeper in that it's not just that consuming those things is bad. It's the consumption of high fat and high carb at the same time that is an issue. So when we look at something like a hamburger that a lot of people are eating, where you're having, a bun and French fries and, sugary condiments and all those things, you're consuming a lot of saturated fat, a lot of cholesterol, a lot of dietary fat. And then you're also spiking insulin or blood sugar and insulin at the same time, which is causing you to store a lot of these things. It's preventing you from properly metabolizing a lot of them. So it is specifically that combination that is the issue related to these conditions. So, and that's what the standard American diet is, right? You hear the standard American diet, it's high fat, high carb. That's kind of what, all of all the meals that we love, if you like nachos, it's high fat, high carb. You like French fries, high fat, high carb, hamburger, all of those things.
Sure.
So that's kind of the thing that people need to understand, is that all of that ranking for, going against the keto diet is all centered around the concept that animal protein is bad for us and cholesterol is bad for us. And it's simply not true. And even worse than that being not true is it's actually the opposite. Animal protein is the most nutrient dense food on the planet. It contains all of the nutrients that we need, but not only all the nutrients we need, also in a form that we can more easily absorb. So we're actually able to access those nutrients better and then actually utilize them. So it's a very big disservice that we kind of do what we do to animal protein and we make people fear it, because it's not just that it's not bad for them, it's that they're actually missing out on an essential health food. And that's the big reason why we have a lot of the health issues we do.
Man, that's good. I don't know if I want to go down the rabbit hole of bioavailability of protein, but there's something to be said for the protein that we have used with animal protein is almost 100% bioavailable, meaning that our body can process that protein and make use of it effectively, whereas the bioavailability of protein found in plants may only be 50% bioavailable. I've heard different numbers from different people, but it's just a small percentage, and it's so key, especially and I'm going to kind of jump to my next thing that people rip on keto about, which is performance, around the gym. Like people say, oh, I need carbohydrates to be able to perform well in the gym. Is that the case? Because we need protein, we need protein to build muscle. I don't think anybody is going to have issues with that. If you're not getting enough protein because you're getting too much of it through plants, or you're not getting enough animal protein or whatever, it's going to be more difficult to build muscle. But people say, oh, well, we don't have enough carbohydrates, and therefore I don't have enough energy, so that when I get to the gym, I can actually lift the weights that I want to lift. Have you seen studies? What is your experience with performance when you're on in ketosis? Yeah.
So this one's one of my favorite kind of parts of this, because I get the idea that carbs are like, I was a 2-sport athlete in college, eating a lot of carbs, carb loading before basketball games, carb loading at halftime, like always having carbs around, because of this thought that you really need them for performance. And I will say, going in this conversation, that it is important to know that carbohydrates are an ergogenic aid. They do improve exercise performance, and they do contribute to muscle building. The hormone insulin is a hormone that can contribute to muscle building. So it is important to know that those things are still useful for performance. But one caveat to that is that if your body can't use those carbohydrates, i.e. you're insulin resistant, because you're not really able to use them very well. So that kind of applies more to the high level athlete who is 7% body fat and incredibly metabolically healthy. Carbohydrates, they're going to help them perform a little bit better. Now, if we're talking more about kind of the general population, all of us that are just trying to work out in the gym and we're just trying to, get in a little bit better shape, or even maybe you're playing in a pickleball league or something like that, like whatever that you have your thing that you want to perform better at, keto is going to be just fine for those things. And, actually keto, the sports performance side of keto was my first introduction to keto. I was, I did a lot of research in college on the keto diet. My first sports nutrition class, day one at the University of Tampa, was the ketogenic diet for endurance performance. And I remember going into that class being like, bullshit, no chance. Like, I know you got to have those sugar gels. I know that you got to have, by the end of that class, I went to the store and bought keto groceries and started keto the next day because I was convinced. And we spent time. So my time at the University of Tampa was spent in the exercise science lab studying the keto diet on various athlete types. So some of them were just general college students. Other of them were, we had basketball players. We had, baseball, soccer, maybe lacrosse too. I can't remember if we had lacrosse in there, but, and we saw improvements in performance and body composition for those people. But this is where it kind of gets interesting. If you look at the research, most of the research will show you that a ketogenic diet impairs performance across all kind of forms of exercise, from endurance to strength, power, and then also muscle building, which I think is important to kind of talk about in that. But the thing is that in all of those studies, what you'll see is there'll be really short-term studies of maybe it's 3 to 5 days of doing the keto diet, or it'll be, one exercise session, a couple days of the diet followed by another exercise session. And the issue with that for anybody, and Andy, you could probably speak to this too, the issue for anybody who has followed a ketogenic diet is, you kind of feel like crap those first few days, because your body has to go through this process called keto adaptation, where we have to, essentially what's going on from a biochemistry standpoint is that we have receptors in our cells that take ketones in for energy. Just like we have the receptors for glucose, we have these little receptors for ketones. And for most of us eating the standard American diet, we're not producing a lot of ketones. These receptors kind of become like dormant, would be a way you could look at it, where they're not very active. And it takes the presence of ketones to activate those and upregulate them and get them kind of functioning appropriately. And during that time, you could expect to experience a decrease in performance because you're not consuming carbohydrates and you're not really quite great at utilizing the ketones that you're making yet. So if you do a study on anybody in the first 3 days, then you're going to find definitely decreases in performance, especially compared to, them eating carbohydrates, 3 days before that and doing that same exercise. So then, what you have to do is you have to look at longer term research. And there's a couple of really good kind of monumental studies. Antonio Paoli was one, he published one where he did like 8 weeks to get them keto adapted, to get I think it was gymnasts, to get them keto adapted, and saw that they were able to maintain across the board a lot of their performance metrics. And in some cases even improve from the stance of like a weight to power ratio. If you're getting a little bit lighter, but your strength is staying the same or your power staying the same, then you're actually improving based on that. So you actually, some people do see improvements. There was another study by a good friend of mine, Rachel Gregory, who published a CrossFit study in 2016 that looked at folks just like us doing CrossFit. And when they got keto adapted, they were able to kind of get the same performance that they saw from from before they were keto adapted. And then a big one, and this is probably the most impressive one, was a study by Jeff Volek, back when he was with Ohio State University. And this was looking at ultra endurance athletes. So these are the folks that are doing like the 50 plus mile runs, I think is what classifies as ultra endurance. And he had athletes that were long-term keto adapted, because keto has actually been pretty accepted in the endurance community for a while. And we can kind of get into why that's the case. And so, he had long-term keto adapted athletes and compared them to, non-keto athletes, so carbohydrate based athletes. And he saw performance the same across the board. And he saw an increase in fat oxidation. So the keto dieters are burning more fat during exercise, which we can talk about why that's a good thing. But then even more interesting is that they actually replenished glycogen, that stored form of carbs. They replenished it at the same rates as the carbohydrate athletes. So a big reason why people will say you have to carb load is because they want you to stock up on those stores. So that glycogen, that stored carbohydrate, we want to carb load because we want to store all those carbs so that they're available for us when we go to exercise and we go to, burn energy. But what he saw is that these keto athletes are actually replenishing glycogen without consuming carbohydrates, and they're doing it at same rate as these non-keto athletes are. So, that kind of debunked most of the reason for why you would want to, consume carbohydrates for exercise. So, and then all of that kind of leads to this idea of, well, why does keto provide any sort of benefit? And I think from there we can kind of start with endurance exercise. So the reason why it's so beneficial for endurance, and the reason why it's been adopted for a longer time in that space, is that if you're an endurance athlete and you're doing, a marathon or a long bike ride, that stored form of carbohydrate that you can that glycogen that you can store, you can only store so much of it. It's a very small source. And that's why you'll see these ultra endurance athletes have to bust out the sugar gels, right? Because they burned through the carbohydrates that they ate before, they burned through the stored carbohydrates, and now they have to take the sugar gel to get a rush of carbs to get them performing again. And that's because, I think for most people, it's something like only 2,000 calories can be stored in the form of carbohydrates or in the form of sugar. Whereas even the leanest endurance athlete, you could be 5% body fat, you have over 20,000 calories stored in fat on your body. So if you're able to tap into that, which is what Volek found in that study, is that these keto athletes, they're tapping into that stored fat. They don't have a kind of a threshold where they run out of energy. They're not going to crash because they can tap into that fat. And that's why you'll see, I have a buddy in Austin, actually, he did the Austin Marathon, good friend of mine, Eric, who did it fasted. He was keto adapted and fasted, and he did the Austin Marathon, and he set a PR. He's a guy who's like a triathlete who wasn't keto before, and he set a PR on that day. He didn't eat any food. He didn't eat anything during it. He's just burning, stored body fat. So from an endurance perspective, it actually makes sense to, I think that it's the optimal way to go about endurance. It would be to not consume, to not really consume carbohydrates and to be fat adapted. Now, I will say on that front too, and I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, but
I like it.
I think the benefit, really the sweet spot for an endurance athlete, anybody out there listening that's into endurance, would be to the dual fuel approach, is what you hear people say, which is the ability. So if you become keto adapted, another term for keto adapted is fat adapted. So that just means that you're good at burning fat, you're good at producing ketones, and more specifically, you're good at transitioning from burning carbs to burning fat. So for most people who are insulin resistant, if you consume carbohydrates and you burn through those carbs, your insulin is typically still elevated. So you're not really able to burn fat. You're not fat adapted yet. You're not good at burning the fat. So a lot of times you'll get hungry, you'll get like the hanger, you'll get low energy, you'll get the shakes, and you'll start tapping into your muscle. And muscle is not a great, one, we don't want to be breaking down muscle, but it's also not a great form of energy for us to use. So, for those people, that's why they have to keep having the sugar, because they can't make that transition smoothly. Now, somebody who's keto adapted, what you'll find is that if they're, and this isn't for the new keto dieter, this is for those people that have been doing it a little bit longer, they're fully adapted. They could consume carbohydrates before the endurance match. They could use those carbohydrates to give them kind of that boost at the beginning. Or let's say if you, mid race, you really want to get like a big boost and like a short-term kind of like a good kick at the end of the race or something like that, you could use those carbohydrates, but your body is going to very effectively switch back to fat once it's burned through those. So that would be the ideal approach, I think, for most kind of serious, like if we're talking really serious performance, I think that's kind of the perfect way to go about it.
It's super interesting.
And then for the other things, and that, so, endurance, I would say I would recommend it. Now for strength and power, it's one of those things where if you do it right, you can maintain, of course you can see improvements if you're increasing muscle mass, you can increase strength and stuff like that. But if your primary goal was, if you were, let's say, a professional athlete and your number one goal is to be explosive and powerful, I probably wouldn't recommend the keto diet to those people, because it's not going to be, that's not going to put you in the top 1 percentile that you need to be if you're a professional athlete. But for the rest of us who just want to be able to like have a good gym session or, play good in their Tuesday night basketball league, the being good at those things isn't the number one goal. It's just one of the many health goals that they have. Then I think keto is a great option for those people, because you're going to be just as good as you were, if not better, if you're, because the other part of this too is, who are we talking about? Are we talking about somebody who is, currently 30 pounds overweight? They're going to see improvement in their athletic. And if you're 30 pounds overweight and you've never exercised, you're going to be improving your exercise performance the whole way through, that you're on keto, because you're kind of new to your journey. But if we're talking about somebody who is, an elite level athlete, who's performing at a very high level, like keto is probably not going to bring a lot extra to the table for them other than, kind of the endurance component. So, but I think when it comes to a lot of us as kind of average Joes, for lack of a better term, keto, when it comes to performance, is going to be just fine.
Yeah. And the cool thing about keto, and I think it's similar to having a kind of continuous glucose meter, is you can at any time know how many ketones or the presence of ketones in your blood, right?
Yep.
And so there is an actual ketone meter, which I know BioCoach, which is someone you're a teammate of. We've got one there. And so, what you do, and this is what I do, I've got a BioCoach, ketone meter, and, you can just do a little prick of your finger, just like you're doing your blood. You can use that and it will show you, what level of ketones that you have in your blood. So you know exactly where you are at any one time. And so, we are going to offer a BioCoach ketone meter to anybody who's on CrowdHealth and they want to experiment with this. So we'll send you a BioCoach ketone meter. We'll put in the show notes how to go and do that. But it's something that's very, very cool. You can see how you do. You can see when you reach ketosis. When we're looking at that meter, what do the numbers mean? And to what level do we need to get to actually be considered like ketosis? You said there's ketones in our blood just kind of naturally, so you will get more than a 0.0 on this ketone meter. But like, what level are you like, that's where we need to be to actually be in ketosis?
Yeah, so there's a couple different schools of thought on that. The general recommendation that you'll see from people is like 0.5 millimolar. So millimolar is just the unit of measurement that we use to measure the concentration of the ketones. So a lot of people will say, above 0.5 means that you're in ketosis. But the one downside to a ketone meter and all ketone testing as it currently stands is that we can only measure how many ketones are in the blood. We can't necessarily measure how well our body is using those ketones. So finding having a set number to shoot for can be difficult, because, when you first start keto, you might be up at, and this is something you commonly see with people, you might be up at like 1.5 millimolar of blood ketones. And then as you continue following the diet, you might find that you're like more down at like 0.7 or something like that. But you feel great. Like you feel better than you did when they were at 1.5. And that's because, theoretically, as you become more efficient at using those ketones, there should be less in the blood because your cells are actually taking them in to be used for energy, right? So I think 0.5 is a good metric to shoot for, that if you're starting keto and you're trying to get keto adapted, like shooting for 0.5 and maintaining that and being above it is going to be a good way to ensure that you're kind of sticking with it. Keto, one of the ways I like to explain keto is it's kind of like a fire, where when you first start it, if you first start a fire, any little bit of wind or drops of rain will put it out. But as you continue building the fire and you stoke it, it can handle some water, it can handle some wind, and it'll kind of stay burning. So, you want to stay with it. You don't want to do keto for 2 days and then take a week off and then do it for a day. You really want at the beginning have some level of adherence where you're following it for a while so that you can kind of get that keto adaptation. So 0.5 is a great number to shoot for. But then after you get adapted, what I like to tell people to do is use the testing number to find out what your sweet spot is. So what is the number where you feel like you have more mental clarity or you have more energy at the gym? Because then you can kind of hack your way to that. Like for me, I know if I'm doing, at 0.7 millimolars is my sweet spot where I feel the click in my brain, where yet my brain's on ketones and I feel like I have more mental clarity. So for me, I can backtrack that and say, all right, well, if I'm following a keto diet and I do intermittent fasting for 18 hours, that gets me to 0.7. So when I give, at KetoCon, if I'm giving a presentation, I'm going into that presentation having fasted for 18 hours so that I've achieved the level of ketosis that I want, kind of for the goal that I have in mind. So I think that's kind of a good approach for people to take, right? Is to figure out like, what is your sweet spot? Because it's probably not, it's not the same for everybody.
Yeah. And I think that playing around with it is really important, because I just kind of mentioned earlier in the podcast, like there are times when I will act poorly when it comes to my nutrition, but there are times in life where you just want to like enjoy the piece of birthday cake with your kids or enjoy the nice glass of wine with your wife or whatever. And so you don't have to be super dogmatic about this, because if you have been doing keto for a while, you can kind of go in and out of ketosis a lot easier than when you start. Yes, when you start, it sucks for a few days because you feel miserable. But once you kind of get into it over a long period of time, your body does adapt, at least mine does, to getting in and out of ketosis in a much more kind of fluid way, as opposed to it being like, oh, I feel like hell for 3 days because I got out of ketosis. It just doesn't happen that way. So if you're starting to get into keto and it feels miserable, keep with it, keep pushing on. Anything good in life, you have to go through a little bit of a pain to get there. It's brutal for the first few days, get past it. And then, once you establish a rhythm, your body figures it out. So one last thing I have
one recommendation.
Oh, go ahead.
Can I throw one more thing out on that? Just for if you're dealing with the, that beginning stage and you're feeling like crap, which is very common. One of the big, so there is this keto adaptation that's a part of that story. But another big reason why a lot of people you'll hear keto flu symptoms thrown out is because of electrolyte deficiencies. So when we're consuming less carbs, we're producing less insulin, our body stores less water. We actually excrete more water. And with that we also excrete a lot of electrolytes, which creates these imbalances. And that can cause things like digestive issues, mood, low energy, muscle cramps, all of these things that people experience during the first stages of keto. So staying hydrated and using electrolytes in those first couple of weeks, in general, most people should be doing that. But in those first couple of weeks of keto, that can get you through a lot of that suck and make it hurt a lot less, at the beginning. I mean, it's still hard to say no to a piece of bread if you've never said no to a piece of bread. So you still have to go through that side of things. Mm-hmm. But in terms of a lot of the side effects you may experience, a lot of that can be alleviated with electrolytes.
Yeah, that's good. I got to go. I ask one more thing before we go. And I think you alluded to it earlier. There has become an industry of keto appropriate food. Not appropriate. It's just branded keto food. And there is entrees, there's snacks, there's all kinds of stuff coming out. And one of the things that I've kind of learned through my, nutritional journey is to eliminate a lot of the things in the foods that you can't pronounce. And I don't always do good with it because I love keto ice cream. But what do we do with that? What do we do with some of these keto snacks that are full of stuff that I can't pronounce? They don't feel whole to me. These are not whole foods. These feel like chemicals that maybe we shouldn't be putting in our body. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed so much since I started. Like, I still think back to that first time I went to the grocery store and there wasn't a single thing on the shelf that said keto, right? Like that, you had to figure out your own stuff, find your own recipe. If you wanted ice cream, you had to go find a recipe for making keto ice cream. You couldn't buy it on the shelf yet. And now that's changed. There's whole sections at health food stores dedicated to keto. And even just at your local grocery store, I mean, Walmart, Target, Publix down here for us in Florida, all of these places have keto stuff. And I did actually work for a keto food and supplement company. It was one of the things that it was important for me to get in there and understand. I worked for Perfect Keto for, I still do work with them. I worked with them for 5 years. And one of the things was I really wanted to learn the food industry. I can only talk shit about something for so long if I don't actually get involved and see what's entailed in the industry, right? So I felt like I had to put my money where my mouth was and kind of learn it. But also, it was really important to me to be a part of a brand that was doing it well. So I can still, to this day, speak nothing but highly about Perfect Keto and the food products that they put out, because we did for one, we had very rigorous guidelines for what ingredients could and couldn't be used. We did extensive blood sugar testing on all the products that we'd put out. All proteins had to be animal-based proteins, trying to make things as whole food as possible. So there are good options out there for these packaged foods. And then there's horrible options out there. These big Kellogg's, General Mills, all these big food producers have also gotten in on the game here. And, these companies are using kitchen chemistry and food chemistry to put together products that, can look keto on a label. So a big thing that people will do is they'll look at net carbs. So net carbs is you take the total carbs on a food and you subtract fiber and sugar alcohols, and then that gives you net carbs. And a lot of people, back in the day before we had these foods, net carbs would be an okay way to go about it, because it would be, you're either eating sugar or you're eating fiber from plants, right? So it's like, yeah, you can do net carbs, that's fine. But now, some of these products, like one of the examples I get, I'll always call them out for it too. Now I'm drawing a blank on who makes the Swedish fish.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. That brand. But it's like one serving of that is actually like, it's a super high amount of total carbs. But what they're doing is they've used chemistry to create these fibers that you can put on the label as a fiber, which allows you to draw the net carb amount down. And then, so you can make it keto friendly because it's, 4 grams net carbs or 3 grams of net carbs. But the total carbs might be third one, the gummy one. It actually broke one of my friend's CGMs. The CGM just turned off, and it doubled my blood sugar. My blood sugar went from 80 to 160 after I consumed it.
I had the exact same experience with those Swedish fish things. Yeah, my blood sugars went sky high, and I was like, hold on a second. I thought these net carbs were really, really low, and it's clear. If you get a continuous glucose meter, you can have some of these foods, and you can see your blood sugars spike or not spike depending upon what you're eating. So it's kind of interesting.
It is. Yeah. I mean, and that's really what you should do. So, I'll say that the best keto diet, the best any diet, is a whole food diet, limiting as much packaged and processed foods as you can. That's the best version of keto. Vegetable, like meat, eggs, and plants, and some dairy if you can tolerate it. That would be the best version of keto. But there's benefit to these things, right? Like if you were going to have if you want to have ice cream, but you don't want to get kicked out of ketosis, like, or you want to at least reduce your carb intake, then, that's not a bad option to go for. Or if you're somebody who, you're in a pinch or you're a snacker, like, having a low carb protein bar can be a good thing. Or, some of these things can be tools or even just transition things. Like maybe you're not ready to completely cut out all of these different foods, but it is something you can do to kind of help you with that transition. So there's a place for them, I think. But what you would have to do is you have to look at the labels, is the first thing, to figure out which ones are good. So if they have seed oils in them, if they have added sugar, if there's a lot of ingredients that you can't pronounce, or if there's just really long ingredient lists, then those products are not ideal packaged food products to be consuming. And then the other thing would be check your blood sugar. Like, every time somebody asks me, like, can you give me, or like, what is this food keto approved? It's like, if it spikes your blood sugar, then no. If it does, then you're good. So, spike or test it, and then that's how you'll really know if it's keto friendly or not. But I think even if you are having some of those foods as a tool, the goal is to transition to being as whole food as possible. But definitely finding some of those can be a good resource for you.
Yeah, that's so good. And the other thing too is you don't need a continuous glucose meter to monitor your blood sugar. You can get a glucometer off of Amazon for $20 or something like that.
And our BioCoach one does glucose as well. So
so there you go. So you can actually take your blood sugar. It's a little pinprick. It really doesn't hurt. And you can get your blood sugars. And if there was people ask, like, what is the number one thing I could do to improve my health? I always say it's like, understand what your blood sugars are doing, because that is so key to understanding just your metabolic health. It's not everything. It's not perfect. Insulin is really, really important. They are related, not always perfectly, but they're related. And so if you understand where your blood sugars are at and over a kind of intermediate term basis, then you get a pretty good sense of where you are metabolically. So, Chris, man, this has been good. I feel
Can
like
I add something to that, Andy?
Yeah,
real
for
quick.
sure.
Sorry, I don't mean to. Right, but one thing I do want to add to that, because I think this is relevant to your audience, is that blood sugar is a great metric to track. I think everybody should, knowing what food spike your blood sugar is important. But one of the things that's crazy about the current healthcare system is that, so the way the trajectory goes for most people is that you'll check your blood sugar when you go to the doctor, and as long as your blood sugar stays in this range that they've decided is 80 to 120, then you're good. And then it's not until your blood sugar gets above 120 that they start saying, okay, we need to start looking at insulin.
Mm-hmm.
The issue with that is that insulin can be high for up to 10 years before your glucose is high. So, what happens is that your insulin is still doing its job. So glucose isn't elevated, but your body's producing a lot of insulin because of the way that your diet is, and your metabolic health maybe isn't that great. So if you have the ability to talk to your doctor and ask for them to take a fasting, they're not going to check it normally until it's too late. Not too late, but you've missed a massive opportunity for prevention if you wait for them to check insulin based on what your blood sugar is. So talk to your doctors about getting insulin tested too. They're also not very expensive to get out of pocket. You could, through your guys' program, whatever, finding a way to get that looked at is going to be a great way to then figure out what you need to do with blood sugar and with your diet and everything like that. So I just wanted to throw that out because knowing how to talk to your doctor about this stuff, I think is important.
Yeah, the insulin is, and we've said it before, is kind of the canary in the coal mine. And you need to understand what that insulin level is. And like I said, there are some proxies for that aren't always perfect. But and waste could be a proxy. Your blood sugars could be a proxy. Yeah. Those things can be proxies, but they are not perfect. They are not perfect at all. And so getting an insulin, get your resting insulin checked is really, really important. Dude, we could go on for another couple hours on this, I feel like, because it's such an interesting topic. Yep. It's such an important one. I will send people over to your Instagram account, which is fun. You have a fun account, and lots of followers over there. I'm
thank you.
Personally jealous of the follower account, but I'm not going to judge myself on that. No, but the Ketologist is where you need to go on Instagram. It's a lot of fun. You'll learn a ton. Chris Irvin, dude, appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
This has been the Healthcare Liberty Lab. Thank you to our listeners and our sponsor, CrowdHealth, for making this possible. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, be it Substack, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or somewhere else. We're glad to have you with us on this mission to rethink healthcare together.